The wagon broke an axle 3 miles outside of Red Hollow. Clara heard the crack before she felt it, a sound like a rifle shot, sharp and final. And then the whole left side of the wagon lurched downward and dragged across the dirt road with a grinding shriek that woke all three boys from the doze they'd finally fallen into after 6 hours of riding. The horse spooked, yanked sideways, and Clara hauled back on the reins with both hands until her palms burned through the thin leather of her gloves. Mama! That was Thomas, the oldest at 11, already leaning over the side to look. The wheels cracked clean through. I can see that, Thomas. What are we going to do? She didn't answer right away. She sat for a moment on the buckboard with the reins loose in her lap and looked out at the flat scrubland spreading in every direction and at the dark shelf of clouds building in the west. The air smelled like iron. She had felt weather coming for 2 hours, but had pushed on anyway because she couldn't afford another night camped on open ground. The boys were out of the dried meat she'd packed in Kansas, and the youngest, Samuel, had been running a low fever since morning. He was 6 years old and currently trying to climb over the wagon side to examine the axle himself. Samuel, sit down. But I want to see. Sit down. He sat. She climbed off the buckboard and walked around to look at the damage herself. The wooden wheel had sheared at the spoke closest to the hub. There was no fixing it on the road. She had no spare. She had, at this point, $2.31 in the coin purse tucked inside her corset, which was everything she had left in the world after the sale of their furniture in Pittsburgh, the train tickets west, the 3 weeks at a boarding house in St. Louis. While she'd tried to figure out what she was going to do with herself and her sons now that James was dead and the creditors had taken the house, she pressed her fingertips against the broken wheel and didn't let herself think about James. She'd given herself 1 week to cry after the funeral, and that week had been 6 months ago. We walk, she said. It's 3 miles, Thomas said. He wasn't complaining exactly. He was stating a fact, the way 11-year-old boys do when they are trying to sound older than they are. I know how far it is. Samuel's got a fever. I know that too. She turned back to the wagon and started pulling down the bags. You and Daniel take the bedrolls. I'll carry Samuel in the bag with the food. Leave anything that isn't necessary. What about the trunk? Daniel asked. He was 8, and the trunk contained what was left of his father's books, which he'd been guarding with a ferocity that had surprised even Clara. She looked at the trunk. It was heavy. It was the only thing left that had belonged to James. Leave it, she said. We'll send someone back for it. Daniel went quiet in the way that meant he was deciding not to argue, and Clara hefted Samuel onto her hip and tried to ignore the way her lower back had been aching since Dodge City. They walked. Red Hollow announced itself with a water tower painted with letters that had been fading for at least a decade, and a main street of perhaps 12 buildings, half of them with their shutters closed against the coming storm. Clara walked down the center of it, with her sons trailing behind her and people watching from doorways and windows with the particular expressionless stare of small frontier towns receiving strangers. She was looking for the house on Pemberton Street. Her late husband's uncle, Harold Whitmore, had written to James 4 years ago. Clara had found the letter in James's desk after the funeral, describing a house on Pemberton Street and a carpentry business, and a wife named Dora and 2 grown daughters. The letter had been cordial, friendly even. James had never written back, which was the kind of thing James did, but Clara had held on to that letter for 6 months as the only thread she had in the West. A man sitting on a barrel outside the hardware store pointed her toward Pemberton without being asked, which meant she looked exactly as lost as she felt. The Whitmore house was the third one on the left, with a neat fence and a kitchen garden that was doing well despite the dry summer. Clara stopped at the gate, shifted Samuel to her other hip, and looked at the house for a moment before she pushed the gate open. She knocked. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 50, sharp-faced, with the kind of mouth that looked like it had spent considerable time pressed into a thin line. She looked at Clara. She looked at the 3 boys. She looked back at Clara. I'm Clara Whitmore, Clara said. James Whitmore's wife. He was Harold's nephew. I wrote a letter in May. I know who you are. Dora Whitmore's voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering a verdict they'd already decided on. Harold's not home. I can wait. Mrs. Whitmore. Dora stepped slightly into the doorframe, which was a body language Clara recognized. It was the language of a door that was about to close. We got your letter. Harold and I discussed it. Clara waited. We have a small house, Dor said. We have our daughters and their husbands living nearby who depend on us. We aren't in a position to take in. She paused, and her eyes moved across Samuel, across Daniel, across Thomas with his bedroll and his sunburned nose. A family. The word family came out in a way that made it sound like an accusation. Clara's arm was cramping from Samuel's weight. The clouds in the west were moving faster now, and she could hear the first distant mutter of thunder. I'm not asking to move in permanently, she said, and she was proud of how level her voice came out. My husband died in January. I have no resources at present, but I am capable of working, and I have plans to— I'm sorry for your loss. Dora said it the way people say it when they aren't particularly. But we cannot help you. Harold agrees. Could I speak with Harold? He's not home. The door closed, not slammed. That would have been almost better. It just closed. Clara stood on the porch step and looked at the painted wood grain of the door for a moment while thunder grumbled again in the distance, closer this time. Mama! Thomas was standing at the gate, watching her. What do we do? She walked back to where her sons were standing and looked down the street in each direction. The wind had picked up. It was pulling at her hair and plastering Samuel's sweaty curls against his forehead. She could feel the storm in her teeth. We find shelter, she said. Where? I don't know yet. Somewhere. She shifted Samuel again. Come on. They made it to the end of the main street before the first fat drops started falling. Clara ducked under the overhang of what appeared to be a closed assay office and pressed Samuel against the building and watched the rain begin in earnest. Daniel pressed against her left side without being asked. Thomas stood slightly apart, as he'd been doing for 6 months, watching the street with a careful expression that was too old for his face. A man across the street had stopped to watch them. He was standing in the doorway of the general store with a canvas work coat and his hat pulled low against the rain. Claire couldn't see his face clearly in the gray light, but she could tell he was looking at her, and she had been stared at enough in the past 6 months that she straightened her back and looked directly back at him. He crossed the street. He was taller than she'd estimated from across the road, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been outdoors long enough to leave its marks. Somewhere in his late 30s, she thought. Hard to tell exactly. His expression was neither friendly nor unfriendly. It was more like a man who had been in the habit of observing things carefully before committing himself to any particular reaction. He looked at her. He looked at the boys. He looked at the sky. You got a place to stay? He said. We're fine, Clara said, which was so obviously untrue as to be almost funny. He didn't call her on it. Wyatt Mercer, he said. I run the cattle operation about 6 miles north of town. Rockingham Ranch. Clara Whitmore. I know. He said it without elaboration, which meant word had already traveled in the small town way that small towns worked. He'd probably heard about Dora's closed door before the door was cold. We don't need charity, Clara said. She said it first because she had found in the past 6 months that she needed to say it first, or it would eat at her later that she hadn't. I'm not offering charity, Wyatt said. I'm short a cook since July, and I've got a bunkhouse that's been sitting empty since I sent 2 hands back east. It's not a comfortable arrangement, but it's dry. In exchange for what? Cooking, whatever else you can manage. He said it plainly. I'll pay fair wages. Clara looked at him. He didn't flinch under the look, which she noticed. Some men did. We're strangers to you, she said. So is most everyone, he said. Storm's getting worse. She said yes because she didn't have another option, and she was at least honest enough with herself to know it. Wyatt Mercer's ranch hand, a young Mexican man named Ernesto who couldn't have been more than 20 and who grinned at the boys with the instant enthusiasm of someone who'd grown up in a large family, brought a wagon around from the livery within 15 minutes, and they loaded into it as the rain came down in earnest. Samuel fell asleep against Clara's arm before they'd left the edge of town. Wyatt rode alongside the wagon rather than in it, and Clara sat under the canvas with her boys and watched the rain sheet across the flat land and thought about what she was doing. She had gotten into a wagon with a man she didn't know in a town she'd never been to and was heading 6 miles out into an empty territory with 3 children in her care and $2.31 and no plan beyond surviving the next 24 hours. James would have had something to say about that, she thought. James would have had several things to say about that, none of them particularly helpful. She pushed the thought away. The ranch appeared out of the rain and the dusk as a cluster of lights. The main house, two outbuildings, a barn that was larger than Clara had expected, and the long, low shape of the bunkhouse. Even in the poor light and the rain, she could see the place was orderly. The fences were maintained. The yard wasn't churned to mud, which meant drainage had been planned for. This was a ranch that was being run carefully. Wyatt came around to help with Samuel, who was now dead asleep and heavy the way sleeping children become, and he carried him from the wagon to the bunkhouse with a matter-of-factness that somehow made Clara feel worse than if he'd been showy about it. There was nothing to react to when someone was simply practical. The bunkhouse was exactly what he'd said. Not comfortable, but dry. 4 bunks along one wall, a wood stove, a table. Clara got the stove going while Thomas and Daniel looked at everything with the careful inventory of boys who had spent 6 months moving through other people's spaces and learned to assess them quickly. "There's food in the main house," Wyatt said from the doorway. He didn't come in past the threshold, which she noticed. "I'll have Ernesto bring something over." You just walked 3 miles in the heat with a sick child and then rode out in a storm," he said. "You can get settled tonight. Tomorrow's soon enough." He left before she could argue. Thomas was looking at her. "He seems all right," he said, with the cautious tone he'd developed for all assessments since his father died. "We don't know him," Clara said. "I know, but he seems all right." Ernesto brought over a pot of beans and cornbread that was still warm and a pitcher of water, and the boys ate like they hadn't eaten all day, which they mostly hadn't. Clara ate too, more than she meant to, and then she got Samuel settled in one of the bunks and sat on the edge of the bed listening to the rain on the roof and the strange night sounds of a ranch. The cattle, distant. The creak of the barn. The horses shifting in their stalls. She had been sitting still for perhaps 10 minutes when she became aware that she was shaking, not from cold. Her hands were trembling in her lap and her jaw was tight, and she pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate until it stopped. She was fine. She was fine. She looked at her son sleeping. Thomas on his back with his arms crossed the exact way James used to sleep. Daniel curled into himself facing the wall, Samuel making the small, soft sounds he made when his fever was down. And she thought very clearly, "I will not let anything happen to them. Not one more thing." The morning came in cold and bright after the storm, with a smell of wet grass and clean air that was almost startling after the closed-in heat of the past weeks. Clara was up before sunrise, as she'd trained herself to be, and she found the main house kitchen without difficulty and had coffee on and bacon started by the time she heard boots on the porch. Wyatt came in and stopped when he saw her. "I told you to..." "I know what you told me," Clara said. "Do you take your coffee black?" A pause. "Yes." She poured it and set it on the table and went back to the bacon. He sat down. He didn't say anything else for a moment, just drank his coffee and watched her work. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, which surprised her. She'd been prepared for awkward deference or for condescension or for the particular kind of supervision that some men offered women working in their space. Wyatt Mercer just drank his coffee. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, because silence was fine, but she also had practical questions. 8 years. "How many hands?" 6, regular, 2 extra in calving season. He set his cup down. "Ernesto is year-round. He's the most useful person on the property." "What time does work start?" "Sunup. Earlier if something needs it. I'll have breakfast ready before sunup." He looked at her in a way she couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Whitmore, you don't need to..." "You said you'd pay fair wages," she said. "That means I work. I would prefer to work. I'll need to understand the household routines, what the men are used to, what you keep in the larder, and what needs to be ordered from town." She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. "I'm not here to recover. I'm here to be useful." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more like recognition. "All right," he said. The boys took to ranch life with a speed that simultaneously relieved and complicated things. Thomas, whose sense of responsible melancholy had been exhausting for 6 months, visibly unfurled in the open space. Ernesto put him to work feeding horses within the first 2 days, and the boy came in for dinner smelling like hay and work and looking more like 11 than he had in months. Daniel found the barn cats and spent his first 3 days establishing diplomatic relations with all 7 of them, emerging periodically to report their names and personalities to anyone who would listen. Samuel's fever broke on the second night, and he promptly attached himself to Wyatt Mercer with the absolute absence of self-consciousness that only 6-year-olds possess. This was its own problem. She'd caught it first on the 3rd morning, Samuel following Wyatt across the yard at a distance of approximately 2 feet, asking questions at the rate of about 1 per 30 seconds. She'd watched from the kitchen window as Wyatt turned, looked down at the child, and said something she couldn't hear. Samuel had laughed. Wyatt had, she would have sworn to this, almost smiled. She went back to her bread dough. She was not going to be sentimental about it. Her youngest son needed male attention because he'd been without his father for 6 months and he was 6 years old. This was a practical reality, not an emotional one, and she was managing it practically by not managing it at all, which was the most efficient approach. The ranch hands were a mixed reception. 2 of them, older men named Pete and Calhoun, who had been there since Wyatt started the operation, were civil from the beginning in the measured way of men who take their cues from their employer, and Wyatt had clearly indicated some standard of behavior. 2 younger hands, brothers named Birch and Denny Hollis, were more pointed. Not rude exactly, pointed. She heard Denny say something to his brother in the yard one afternoon that involved the word charity and a laugh. She'd been inside the barn looking for a bucket, and they hadn't seen her. She didn't say anything. She just noted it. On the following Saturday, when the men came in from 2 days of fence work, and she had beef stew and fresh bread and apple cake on the table, Denny Hollis ate 3 helpings and told her it was the best meal he'd had in 6 months. He said it like it was a simple fact, not an apology. She accepted it as one. The charity comments stopped. She'd been on the ranch 11 days when she had her first real conversation with Wyatt that wasn't about logistics. It was evening. The boys were asleep. She'd taken to sitting on the bunkhouse step after dark, when the air cooled enough to be pleasant, and she was doing that, just sitting with her hands loose in her lap, looking at the enormous sky that she was still not entirely used to, when she heard him come out of the main house. He crossed the yard and stopped a few feet from the bunkhouse step, which was close enough to talk but clearly not a presumption. "Can't sleep?" he said. "I sleep fine," she said, which was not entirely true but not entirely false. "I just like sitting out." He looked up at the sky with her for a moment. The stars here were different from Pittsburgh, more of them and lower seeming, and without any competing light to dim them. "How long were you married?" he asked. The question was abrupt enough that she almost didn't answer, but it wasn't unkind. It had the quality of a man who didn't waste words on small talk, and so his real questions came out without much preamble. 13 years, she said. "Were you happy?" That one took her longer. "Some of it," she said finally. "He was a difficult man in some ways, capable of great kindness, and also—" She stopped. "We were honest with each other mostly. That counts for something." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. She'd known this from something Pete had said in passing. She didn't say "I'm sorry" because he hadn't said it to her, and there was something clean about that. "Were you happy?" she asked. "Yeah," he said simply. "We were." He went back inside about 5 minutes later without any ceremony, and Clara sat on the step for another half hour listening to the night and thinking about the particular way grief changed shape over time, how it stopped being the only thing you could see and started being something you carried with you always, like an old injury that ached in cold weather. She thought about the fact that she had $2.31 and also a job and also a roof and also 3 sons who were sleeping instead of sick or frightened. It wasn't nothing. The tension started in the 3rd week. She'd been in town for supplies with Ernesto when she'd heard Mabel Forsyth, the minister's wife, stout, with the town's most active interest in other people's business, telling someone in the dry goods store that it was a shame what was happening at the Rocking M, and that Wyatt Mercer was too soft-hearted for his own good, and that no one knew anything about this woman or where she'd really come from. Ernesto had gone still beside her. Clara had continued examining a bolt of cloth she had no intention of buying. "They don't know anything," Ernesto said quietly when Mabel had moved on. "They know what they need to know," Clara said. Which was true. She didn't owe Mabel Forsyth or anyone else in Red Hollow an accounting of her life or her grief or her choices. But she was also practical enough to know that what people thought about her in this town would affect how she could live in it, and she was planning to live in it. She had to live somewhere, and the alternatives were limited. And so she thought carefully about the problem on the ride back to the ranch. She couldn't make people trust her. She could only make it inconvenient for them not to. She started attending the small Sunday services that the community held in the school building, which was the same building where she'd heard there was no regular teacher since the last one had left in the spring. She took her boys and sat in the third row and was polite to everyone who spoke to her and quietly asked the right person, a woman named Harriet Oakes, whose husband was on the town council, whether there was anyone handling the children's schooling since the teacher left. There wasn't, Harriet said. It was a real problem, the older children especially. I taught school for 2 years before my marriage, Clara said, in Philadelphia. Harriet looked at her with a sharpness that was, Clara thought, the look of someone doing a rapid recalculation. Did you? Harriet said. I did. I imagine I could offer something informal on weekday mornings if there was somewhere to hold it. She paused. A few hours? Nothing official? Just to keep the children progressing until someone permanent can be arranged. She said it like a practical suggestion, not a bid for goodwill, which it was both. By the following Thursday, she had a room in the church hall and 7 children whose parents had sent them. By the week after that, it was 12. On a Tuesday in late September, she came back from the morning teaching session to find Wyatt Mercer repairing a section of corral fence near the barn, and she stopped because there was something about the way he was working, focused, unhurried, with the particular economy of motion that came from doing physical work long enough to stop forcing it. That made her pause before she spoke. She'd been watching people more carefully lately, or maybe she'd always watched people and only now had enough stillness to notice she was doing it. There's something wrong with the drainage on the south pasture, she said, which was not what she'd planned to say. She'd planned to say nothing, just walk past. Wyatt looked up. I know. The northwest corner is staying wet. I think one of the stock troughs is overflowing somewhere upstream. I walked out there this morning before the teaching session. He set down his hammer slowly and looked at her. Not annoyed. More like he was recalibrating something. You walked out to the south pasture. I wake up early. She paused. If I'm wrong, never mind. I just thought it was worth mentioning. He looked at her for another moment, then, show me. They walked out together, which was the first time she'd really been alone with him at any distance from the buildings, and she showed him what she'd seen. The soft ground in the corner, the way the water was tracking. He crouched down and looked at it, and then stood up and looked upstream toward where the secondary trough was positioned. You're right, he said. Overflow valves probably stuck. He said it like it was a simple fact, and then looked at her in a way that wasn't simple at all. You're observant, he said. I've had to be, she said. They stood in the south pasture with the fall air moving over the long grass, and neither of them said anything else. And Clara was aware in a way she hadn't been in a long time of being in a specific place, with a specific person, on a specific ordinary morning, not passing through, not surviving, not just getting to the next part, just there. She walked back to start the midday meal, and she didn't let herself think too much about the feeling. But she noticed it. She noticed it very clearly. The drainage problem on the south pasture turned out to be exactly what Clara had said it was. A stuck overflow valve on the secondary trough, which had been slowly saturating the corner of the field for the better part of 2 weeks. Wyatt fixed it that same afternoon. He didn't mention it at dinner, but the following morning, when Clara came into the kitchen at 4:45 to start breakfast, there was a new pair of work gloves on the table beside the coffee pot. No note, no explanation. She put them on. They fit well enough, which meant he'd looked at her hands at some point and made an estimate, and she wasn't sure what to do with that information, so she filed it away and started the coffee. October came in on a cold wind that swept down from the north and stripped the cottonwoods along the creek faster than anyone expected. The ranch shifted into a different rhythm. Shorter days, longer evenings, the particular compressed feeling of a place that knows winter is real and is adjusting itself accordingly. Wyatt and the hands pushed hard through the first 2 weeks, moving cattle to the lower pastures, reinforcing the barn roof where 2 sections had gone soft, laying in the hay supply that would get them through to spring. Clara watched the pace of it and matched it in the kitchen, Bigger meals, earlier starts, baking bread in double batches, so there was always something when men came in cold and needed warming fast. She also kept the teaching sessions going 3 mornings a week in the church hall, which meant she was walking the 6 miles to town and back, or borrowing the wagon on mornings when Ernesto could spare it. Harriet Oakes stopped her after the 4th week session and said, "You know, several of the parents have started asking if you might be willing to teach the older children too, the ones who need algebra." "Do they?" Clara said. "Mrs. Whitmore." Harriet folded her hands in the particular way of a woman who has made a decision and is delivering it as though it was always obvious. "You have done more for the children of this community in 4 weeks than we've managed in the 6 months since the last teacher left. That's just a fact." Clara accepted this without showing what it did to something in her chest. "I can add an afternoon session for the older ones," she said. "Thursdays. I'll let the families know." She walked back to the ranch that afternoon in better spirits than she'd been in months, which was the kind of thing she noticed but didn't dwell on. She had learned, slowly, the hard way, that good feelings were real, but they were also fragile, and the best approach was to note them and keep moving. She noted it. She kept moving. The trouble with the Hollis brothers surfaced again in the 3rd week of October, in a way that was harder to dismiss than an overheard comment. She'd been in the barn looking for the spare lantern when she heard Birch and Denny talking in the tack room on the other side of the partition. She wasn't trying to listen. She was trying to find the lantern. "Don't see why Mercer keeps paying her the same rate as the hands," Denny was saying. "She cooks and she teaches some kids. That's not the same as actual work." "She fixed the south pasture problem," Birch said, with the flat accuracy of someone who is less interested in the argument than his brother. "That was luck. She walked out there and noticed something. It's not the same thing. You said the food got better." "The food is fine, Birch. That's not the—" A pause, and then Denny's voice dropped into something more mean-spirited. "All I'm saying is she showed up with nothing and 3 brats, and now she's settled in real comfortable, and Mercer's looking at her a certain way, and I don't think it's entirely professional." She stopped moving. In the silence of the barn, she was suddenly very aware of her own breathing. "Keep your mouth shut about that," Birch said. His voice had changed. "I'm just saying what everyone's saying." "Then you're saying what everyone's saying in front of me. Keep it to yourself." She found the lantern. She left the barn by the side door and walked back across the yard and into the kitchen, where she stood at the sink for a moment and looked out the window at the afternoon light on the fence posts and thought several things she had no particular use for thinking. Everyone's saying, which meant the gossip that had started with Mabel Forsythe had not stopped at Mabel Forsythe, which meant that her position on this ranch was being discussed in town in terms that were unfair and also, she understood practically, potentially damaging. It didn't matter that nothing improper was happening. What mattered, in small frontier communities, was the story that got told. She thought about it while she started the dinner preparations. She quartered the potatoes harder than she needed to. The question was whether to say something to Wyatt. She'd been here 6 weeks and she had no clear read on how he handled this kind of thing. Whether he was the kind of man who preferred to know or preferred not to, whether bringing it to him would help or complicate things in ways she couldn't predict. She knew he was private. She knew he took longer to commit to a position than most men she'd encountered, but once he committed, he didn't move. She didn't know what he'd do if she told him his hands were gossiping about her character. She decided to wait. She would wait and see whether it got worse or better on its own. It got worse. The specifics came from Thomas, which she hadn't expected. Her son came home from an afternoon in town. He'd started running the occasional errand on the ranch horse, which Ernesto had approved, and which Thomas treated as the most solemn responsibility of his life. And he came into the kitchen with the look on his face that she knew. It was the look he'd had after the school in St. Louis, where the other boys had said things about his father dying because they couldn't pay their debts. "What happened?" she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas set the saddlebag on the table. "Some man at the store. I don't know who he was." He paused. "He said something to another man about you and Mr. Mercer. He said—" Thomas stopped. He was 11 and he was trying to be careful with it. "He said you came here on purpose, to find a rich man." The kitchen was quiet. "He doesn't know what he's talking about," she said. "I know that." "Then don't carry it." "I'm not carrying it, Mama. I'm telling you." His voice had an edge that was his father's voice, exactly. You should know what people are saying. She looked at her son, at the stubbornness and the loyalty and the way he'd been trying to stand between her and the world's opinion for 6 months. And she felt the same complicated thing she always felt when she saw James in him. Pride and grief, and something that was almost tenderness but with teeth in it. You're right, she said. Thank you. Are we going to leave? She thought about that. The coin purse had $11 in it now, which was 6 weeks of wages and more money than she'd had since before James's death. The boys were sleeping well. Samuel hadn't been sick since that first night. Daniel had learned the names of all 7 barn cats and was currently teaching the youngest one to follow commands with mixed but enthusiastic results. No, she said. Thomas nodded as though she'd confirmed something he'd already decided. She told Wyatt 3 days later. Not because she'd planned to. She'd actually made a fairly firm decision not to. But because he brought it up first. It was evening, the late October kind where dark came early and the temperature dropped fast once the sun was gone, and she was on the bunkhouse step with her coat on, and he came out of the main house and crossed the yard. And this time he didn't stop at a conversational distance. He sat down on the step beside her, which put him close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold air. You've heard what's being said in town, he said. Yes. I want you to know I know you don't. She said it before he could finish, because she did know, and the clarification felt unnecessary, and also somehow, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, slightly painful. I've been thinking about it. And I think the only way through it is to keep doing what I'm doing. Teaching, working, making it inconvenient for the story to stick. He was quiet for a moment. Then, some of it might not go away regardless of what you do. I know that too. The wind moved through the bare cottonwoods along the creek and made a sound like dry paper. Wyatt had his elbows on his knees, his hands loose, looking out at the dark. I could speak to people, he said. Make clear that the arrangement is legitimate. That might make it worse. He considered that. Yeah, he said. It might. There's something I want to ask you, she said. She'd been working up to this for 3 days, and she thought she might as well do it now while she had the courage of the cold air and the dark. Is there anything improper in how you're treating me? Because if there is something I'm not seeing, I need to know. He turned his head and looked at her. No, he said. All right. She believed him. The word had come out flat and immediate, without the particular quality that words get when someone is managing them. Is there anything from your side? He said. He said it in exactly the same tone. No. All right. They sat for another few minutes. She was aware of having just had an extremely direct conversation that most people never had. And she was also aware that having it had been the right thing, and that the fact that he'd asked his question with the same directness she'd asked hers meant something she was going to file away carefully and not examine too closely tonight. One of the Hollis brothers said you were looking at me a certain way, she said. She didn't know why she said that. She blamed the cold. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Denny, he said, not a question. His brother shut it down. Yeah, Birch does that. He paused. I'll talk to Denny. You don't need to. I'm going to talk to Denny. He said it with a finality that wasn't anger exactly, more like a man who has calculated his threshold and reached it. Not because of what he thinks, because of what he says in front of your sons. She hadn't told him about Thomas. She thought about asking how he knew, and then decided she didn't need to know everything. Thank you, she said. He got up and went back inside, and she sat on the step in the cold for another while. She was not, she told herself, going to think about the phrase looking at me a certain way, or about the pause that had come before Wyatt's response to it. She was not going to think about that at all. She thought about it for 20 minutes. Gatimt. November arrived, and with it a cold that had weight to it, the kind that settled into the bones of the buildings and required constant attention to the stoves. Clara had settled into the ranch's rhythms completely enough by now that the days had a quality of natural purpose. She was up before dawn, breakfast done, and cleared before the hands started their morning work. The teaching sessions 3 mornings a week, back to the ranch for the midday meal. Afternoons managing the household supplies and mending and whatever else needed doing. Dinner, evenings. It was, she realized, the most structured her life had been in years. James had been brilliant in some ways and chaotic in others, and the chaos had extended to the household in ways she'd spent 13 years accommodating. There was something she hadn't expected in the clean functionality of the ranch's demands. Not ease, because nothing about it was easy, but a kind of clarity. She knew what was needed. She provided it. The day had shape. She hadn't felt that since before he got sick. The boys were expanding in ways that continued to surprise her. Thomas had started helping Wyatt with the morning cattle check on weekends, which meant getting up at 4:30 and riding out in the cold, and he did it without a single complaint, which was remarkable for a boy who had complained about setting the table in Pittsburgh. Daniel had finished diplomatically acquiring all 7 barn cats and had moved on to asking Ernesto to teach him Spanish, which Ernesto was doing with enormous enthusiasm and which resulted in Daniel greeting everyone at the dinner table in progressively more complex sentences until even the Hollis brothers, who had been subdued since Wyatt's quiet conversation with Denny, were laughing. Samuel had, apparently, fully adopted Wyatt Mercer as a secondary caretaker and stopped asking anyone's permission about it. He showed up wherever Wyatt was with the confidence of a child who has not yet learned that this might be unwelcome, and Wyatt, this was the part Clara couldn't entirely account for, let him. Not with warmth exactly, more with a kind of solemn accommodation, the way a serious man treats a child he has decided is worth taking seriously. She'd found them once, on a Saturday morning, sitting together on the top rail of the corral fence, with Wyatt pointing out something about the way one of the horses was moving. Samuel was nodding with the concentrated expression of a 6-year-old receiving important technical information. She went back inside before either of them saw her. The first real test came in the second week of November, and it came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. A man named Gerald Forsyth, Mabel's husband, the minister, who she'd assumed was more moderate than his wife, came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon. She was alone in the kitchen when he arrived. Wyatt was out with the hands, Ernesto was at the barn. She answered the door. He was a thin man with the slightly pinched expression of someone who believed they were delivering unpleasant news out of duty rather than satisfaction, though Clara had lived long enough to know those weren't always different things. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're not." She didn't invite him in. She stood in the doorway. He had a way of looking past her into the kitchen that she noticed and didn't react to. "I've come as a representative of the community, in a sense. Some of the families whose children you've been teaching, and they have appreciated it, please know that—" "But," Clara said. "Is he—" He paused at the interruption but recovered smoothly. "There have been some concerns raised about the arrangement here at the ranch. Some parents feel that, given the questions about the nature of your situation, it might not be appropriate for you to be in a position of influence over the children of the community." She looked at him for a moment. He had the grace to not quite meet her eyes. "What specifically," she said, "is the concern about my situation?" "Well, that I'm a widow," she said. "That I work for wages. That I'm a woman who makes decisions for herself." She kept her voice level. "I want to be precise about which of those things is the problem, Reverend Forsyth." He was flushing slightly. "There are questions about the propriety of your living arrangement at the ranch." "I live in the bunkhouse," she said, "with my 3 sons. I work as a cook and household manager in exchange for fair wages and shelter." "What specifically is improper about that?" "It's—" He was struggling now, which was, she thought, at least honest. "It's more the perception—" "The perception," she said, "belongs to the people who made it, not to me." She looked at him steadily. "Reverend Forsyth, I am a woman with 3 children and no family and no inherited resources. I am doing the most reasonable thing available to me in my circumstances, and I am doing it with complete propriety. If some members of this community have decided otherwise without evidence, that is their failing, not mine." She paused. "Now, if there is a specific and factual concern about my teaching that you'd like to raise, I'm happy to hear it." There wasn't one. He left 10 minutes later in the stiff way of a man who had come to deliver a warning and had instead received one. She closed the door and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands pressed against the counter, not shaking exactly, but close enough that she needed to stand still until it passed. Wyatt came back at 4 o'clock and she told him about Forsyth before dinner, not because she thought he needed to fight her battles, but because he lived here and it involved his ranch, and he had a right to know. She told it plainly, without dramatic detail. He listened. He said, "How did you leave it?" He left without making a specific complaint. Wyatt was looking at the fire he'd built up in the kitchen stove. He'll go back and tell his wife you were difficult. Probably. Mabel Forsyth will be offended. I imagine. He looked at her. There was something in the look that she'd started to recognize, a kind of attention that was particular to him, the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. You handled it right, he said. It was a simple statement. He wasn't congratulating her. He was just assessing it, honestly, the way he assessed the drainage on the south pasture or the fence line or a sick horse. She found she preferred that to almost any kindness she'd been offered in the past 6 months. I know, she said. Thank you. Put. December came. The teaching sessions had grown to 15 children across 2 age groups, and Harriet Oakes had quietly sourced 2 donated arithmetic primers and a grammar book from the town's more literate families, which meant Clara had actual teaching materials for the first time. She'd also started a small lending arrangement, letting older children take the primers home for a week at a time, which required her to keep careful notes about who had what and when it was due back. And she managed this on a sheet of paper she kept folded in her coat pocket. She was adding to it one evening at the kitchen table when Wyatt came in from his office, which was a small room off the main hall where he kept the ranch's accounts, and stopped when he saw what she was doing. What's that? She showed him the lending chart. He looked at it for a moment. You're tracking this yourself, he said. Someone has to. How many families have borrowed a book? 11. The Abernethy family has had the grammar book for 9 days. I'm going to need it back Thursday. She paused. I've been thinking I could write to a publisher in St. Louis about donated educational materials. Some publishers do it for frontier communities. I taught in Philadelphia long enough to know who to write to. He was looking at her with that particular attention again. Do it, he said. Use the ranch address. I'll pay the postage. She looked up. This isn't your... It's my address, he said. And I want those children to have books. Write the letter. She wrote it the following morning, before breakfast. She kept it brief and factual and did not indicate that she was anything other than an established community teacher, which was, she thought, essentially true at this point. 3 weeks later, a package arrived from St. Louis containing 14 primers, a set of geography maps, and a note from the publisher saying he was glad the frontier was still being civilized, one schoolroom at a time. She put the maps up on the church hall wall, and when the children came in and saw them, they went quiet the way children do when they encounter something genuinely new. She stood in the back of the room and watched them crowd around the maps, pointing and arguing about distances, and she felt something that was close to satisfaction, but wasn't quite, something more alive than that. Something that felt like a future being assembled piece by piece from materials she was sourcing herself. She had known Wyatt Mercer for 4 months by the time Christmas arrived, and she understood some things about him that she thought he probably didn't know she understood. She knew that he got up twice most nights to check the barn, which was a habit left over from some cattle loss years ago that Pete had mentioned once without much detail. She knew that he had a particular difficulty with paperwork, not because he was bad with numbers, he wasn't, but because the accounting required him to sit still with the door closed, and he was a man who needed to move and to have an unobstructed view of the yard. She knew that he'd built most of the main house himself in the early years of the ranch, which explained why certain things were perfectly made and others were slightly off, in the way of a man who learned as he went and didn't always go back to correct the earlier mistakes. She knew that when his wife was mentioned, not often but occasionally, he got very still, and the stillness was a different kind from his ordinary quiet. It was more careful. She knew he'd looked at her, as Denny Hollis had said, a certain way. She knew this because she had been looking at him in certain ways too, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. She was less honest with herself about what to do about it. Christmas was a modest affair. She made a good dinner. The boys received small gifts that she'd been quietly putting together for weeks, and Ernesto produced a bottle of something from somewhere that the men shared around the fire in the main house, to which she and the boys were invited and attended. It was, For a few hours, domestic in a way she hadn't experienced since before James's illness, comfortable and warm and unguarded. Samuel fell asleep on the floor by the fire, and at some point she looked up and found Wyatt watching the sleeping child with an expression she wasn't meant to see. It lasted only a second before he noticed her, and it became neutral again. She looked back at the fire. She was not going to fall in love with Wyatt Mercer. She was a practical woman in a practical situation, and she was going to remain very clear about that. She had been telling herself this, with the decreasing conviction, for approximately 6 weeks. The new year came in cold and still. On the 2nd of January, she was in the barn with Thomas, who was helping her move some stored grain to a drier spot after a section of the loft roof had started letting in moisture. They were working steadily, not talking much, when she heard voices from outside. Wyatt's voice, and a woman's, and she registered the woman's voice as unfamiliar before she could think about why it mattered. She kept moving grain. The woman turned out to be a Mrs. Alderton from the neighboring spread 12 miles east, recently widowed herself, mid-40s, with a directness that Clara immediately respected and also immediately understood was being deployed. Margaret Alderton was a capable woman who was assessing the situation at the Rocking M with the unhurried precision of someone who had made it her business to know the score. She stayed for dinner. She was charming and practical and slightly too interested in the details of the domestic arrangement for it to be pure social curiosity. After dinner, while the boys were settled and Ernesto and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, Clara was washing dishes, and Margaret Alderton stood with a cup of coffee and said conversationally, "He's a decent man, you know." "Wyatt, lonely as a fence post, but decent." "I know he's decent," Clara said. "I've known him 6 years, since before Ellen died." A pause. "Half the women in the county have made some attempt in that time." Clara kept washing dishes. "And?" "Nothing stuck," Margaret said. She set her coffee cup down. "He's particular. Doesn't make decisions fast, but he doesn't reverse them either." She paused again, with the timing of a woman who has thought about what she's going to say. "Just so you know what kind of man you're working for." "Thank you," Clara said. She turned and met Margaret Alderton's eyes, which were sharp and not unkind. "Just so you know, I'm not maneuvering." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, genuinely, which transformed her face. "No," she said. "I can see that. That's why I said what I said." She left an hour later on good terms, and Clara finished the dishes and put the kitchen in order for morning, and went to bed without letting herself think too much. But she did think for a while in the dark about the word lonely, about a man who woke twice a night to check the barn, about new work gloves on the table, sized to fit her hands. She thought about what it might mean to stop measuring everything by whether she could afford it, and what she was afraid she might find if she did. She didn't have an answer. She went to sleep. Outside, the January wind moved over the flat frozen land of Red Hollow, and the stars were very clear, and the Rocking M was dark and quiet except for the sound of one set of boots crossing the yard toward the barn at 2 in the morning, and then, a while later, crossing back. The first case appeared on a Thursday. Pete came in from the morning cattle check walking wrong. Not limping exactly, but moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing something they haven't admitted to yet. Clara noticed it from the kitchen window, and noticed it again at breakfast when he barely touched his food, which was not a thing Pete did. The man ate like it was work he took seriously. "You feeling all right?" she asked when the others had gone out. "Little off," he said. "Slept cold last night." "Do you have a fever?" "Don't fuss." She touched the back of her hand to his forehead anyway, which he submitted to with the resigned dignity of a large man being managed by a smaller woman. He was running hot. "Go to the bunkhouse," she said. "There's fence work. Pete." She looked at him steadily. "Go to the bunkhouse." He went. By Saturday, Birch Hollis was down. By the following Tuesday, 2 more of the hands had it, and the hand from the neighboring spread who'd come to help with a broken wagon wheel had taken it back home with him. Clara heard the word influenza for the first time from the doctor who rode out from town, a thin, overworked man named Halliday, who had the look of someone who had stopped being surprised by things some years back. "It's moving through the county," Halliday said. He was talking to both her and Wyatt in the kitchen, which had become the informal command center for the ranch's medical situation. 3 families in town already. The Abernethy boy is bad. You'll want to isolate whoever's sick, keep them warm, keep liquids in them, and watch for when the breathing gets hard. That's when it turns." "What do we do when the breathing gets hard?" Clara asked. "Pray," he said, and then looked like he regretted saying it. "Keep them upright as much as possible. Steam helps. And send for me, though I can't promise how fast I can get here." He left them with a bottle of something that smelled medicinal and a look in his eyes that Clara filed under things she was not going to think about until she had to. By the end of that week, 4 of the 6 regular hands were sick. Denny Hollis had gone home to his family's place in town, which Clara thought was probably the right call, even if it left the ranch short-handed. Ernesto was still standing, moving between his own work and helping manage the sick men in the bunkhouse with a steadiness that she had come to rely on more than she'd expected. Thomas had quietly taken over the horse feeding without being asked, which she noted and did not comment on because commenting on it would make it a thing he might feel proud of when she needed him to just keep doing it. And then on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of January, Wyatt didn't come in for breakfast. She knew before she knocked. There was something in the silence from the main house that morning that was different from his normal early rising quiet. She'd been on the ranch long enough to know the sounds it made, and the absence of certain sounds, boots on the porch boards, the particular way the front door latched, told her something before she had specific information. She knocked twice and opened the door. He was at the kitchen table, dressed, which meant he'd gotten up and intended to start the day. But he'd stopped there, one hand flat on the table's surface, and he was breathing in a way that had some labor in it. "How long?" she said. "I'm fine." "Wyatt?" She crossed to him and put her hand on his forehead. He was burning. The heat of it shocked her even though it shouldn't have. "How long have you felt this way?" 2 days. He said it with the particular shame of a man who has been hiding something he considers a weakness. "I thought it would pass. 2 days." She kept her voice neutral with some effort. "And you've been working." "Someone has to. Ernesto and Thomas have been managing. And me." She stepped back. "Can you walk?" "Of course I can." He stood up and then sat back down, which answered that. "All right," she said. "Stay here. I'm going to get the spare bedding from the bunkhouse. You're not going back to your room. It's too cold on that side of the house, and I can't check on you from there." "You don't need to check on me." "I am going to check on you," she said. "You can be difficult about it after you can stand up." He didn't argue further, which told her more than his temperature did about how sick he actually was. She set him up in the room off the kitchen. It had been a storage room, but it had a decent window and enough floor space for a cot she dragged in from the bunkhouse with Ernesto's help. She got him horizontal, which took more negotiation than it should have, and covered him with enough blankets to account for the fever sweats she knew were coming. She checked Pete and the others in the bunkhouse. Pete was improving, Birch was stable, the other 2 were holding, and then she came back to the kitchen and stood for a moment with her hands braced on the counter, looking at the door of the room where Wyatt was lying, and she thought very clearly about what this meant. 4 hands incapacitated, the ranch owner down. February approaching, which meant the coldest part of the winter was still ahead, and the cattle needed feeding and checking every day regardless of who was well enough to do it. The finances of the ranch were in Wyatt's office in a ledger she had no right to access. The supplier in Dodge City was due for an order she didn't know the details of. And there was the matter of the horses, the hay rationing, the sections of South Fence that Pete had been meaning to finish before he got sick. She took a slow breath and started making a list. What? She ran the ranch for 18 days. She wouldn't have said it like that to anyone because it wasn't quite true. Ernesto was doing most of the actual cattle work, and Thomas was more useful than any 11-year-old boy had a right to be. And Birch recovered after the first week and immediately got back on his feet despite her telling him not to. But the decisions came to her. When Ernesto didn't know whether to move the herd or hold them. When the hay supplier's man came out from town with a bill she wasn't sure about. When the water trough on the east side froze solid and someone had to decide how to handle it. They came to Clara, and she made the calls. She made some of them wrong. The hay bill she paid in full when she probably could have negotiated a deferral, which Wyatt told her later, and which she accepted as a fair point. She made a decision about the east fence that Birch thought was overcautious, and which turned out, in fact, to be overcautious. She kept the cattle on the lower pasture 3 days longer than she probably needed to because she was worried about the weather, and the weather held fine. But she kept the ranch running, which was the main thing. She visited Wyatt 3 times a day: morning, midday, evening. She brought food when he could take it, broth when he couldn't, and she sat with him long enough to make sure his breathing hadn't changed before she went back to whatever the next problem was. He was a difficult patient in a way she might have found funny under different circumstances. Not complaining exactly, but constitutionally opposed to being still, always trying to assess the situation from a horizontal position and give instructions about operations he couldn't see. The east pasture fence, Birch and Ernesto handled it. There's a section near the creek. I know about the creek section. We've reinforced it. Drink your broth. I don't need... Wyatt. He drank his broth. On the 4th day, the fever spiked. She'd been warned about this by Halliday, the way it sometimes went up before it came down. But knowing it intellectually didn't make the reality of it less alarming. He was confused that night, talking at intervals about things she couldn't track. Something about a horse, something about a field boundary. And once, very clearly, a name she recognized as his wife's. She sat in the chair beside the cot and kept the damp cloth on his forehead changed out regularly, and did not think about what she would do if the breathing changed in the way Halliday had described. Around 2 in the morning, he came back into something closer to sense and found her sitting there and said, with the rusty voice of a sick man, "You should sleep." "I slept this afternoon." "Clara." It was a very efficient nap. She wrung out the cloth and replaced it. "How do you feel?" "Like something that's been through a thresher." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been sitting here all night." "Not all night. I checked on the boys an hour ago." Another silence. The lamp was turned low and the room was warm from the stove she'd kept going. Outside, the wind was doing something to the roof that she'd been listening to for hours and had decided was not structural. "Ellen used to do this," he said. He said it quietly, not like he was making a point, more like it had come out of him without a full decision being made. "Sit up when someone was sick. She was better at it than me. I'd fall asleep in the chair every time." A pause. "She sat with my father for 3 days when he was dying. I couldn't have done it." Clara kept her hand on the cloth on his forehead. "I didn't know she sounded like that." "Like what?" "Capable. Stubborn in the right direction." He made a sound that was nearly a laugh. "Yeah," he said. "She was both." "You must miss her." The word miss felt inadequate. She knew it even as she said it. But he didn't correct her, just turned his head slightly toward the wall and said, "Every day? Less than I used to, which is its own kind of thing to live with." She understood that. The way grief changed from something that flattened you to something you carried, and the complicated guilt that came with it getting lighter. "James?" she said, which was the first time she'd said his name out loud to Wyatt, she realized. "He was sick for 8 months before he died. I spent most of that time being angry at him." She paused. "Not for dying, for not telling me how bad it was until it was too late to do anything. He made decisions I should have been part of, and he did it because he thought he was protecting me, and instead he left me." She stopped. "He left us with very little and no plan." The fire was doing its quiet work in the small stove. "Were you angry at him after?" Wyatt asked. "For about 4 months, and then I just missed him, even the parts that were hard." She adjusted the cloth again. "He could be infuriating. He also read to the boys every night without fail for 11 years, even when he was tired, even at the end." Wyatt was quiet for a while. She thought he might have drifted off. Then, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly. When I came across the street in the rain, I saw a woman with 3 kids and almost nothing, and I thought I knew most of what the situation was." He paused. "I was wrong about most of it." "What were you wrong about?" "How much of it you'd already figured out," he said, "and how long you'd been doing it alone before I offered anything." She didn't answer that. There wasn't much to say to it. He was right, and he knew it, and he wasn't saying it to make her feel better. He was saying it the way he said most things, which was because it was accurate. "Go to sleep," she said. "You'll stay?" She looked at him. He was watching her from the cot with the unguarded look of a man who is too sick to maintain his usual careful composure. She thought about all the versions of that question, what it might mean, what she might feel about what it meant. And then she set all of that aside because it was 4 in the morning and he had a fever and she was tired. Yes, she said, I'll stay. The fever broke on the 6th day the way fevers break, not dramatically, but gradually, like a siege lifting. She came in at dawn and found him cooler to the touch and sleeping in a different quality, not the restless fighting sleep of the sick, but the flat, heavy sleep of someone actually resting. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the lamp in her hand, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully realized had been tight. She went and made the coffee. He was sitting up by mid-morning, and the first thing he said was that he wanted to see the ranch accounts. You can't. I'm not asking to ride fence. I want the ledger. She brought him the ledger. He looked through it with the focused silence of a man reassessing a situation, and she stood by the window and waited. You paid the hay bill in full, he said. I know. You told me already. I'm not criticizing. I'm seeing the whole picture. He turned a page. The South Pasture fence repair. Who authorized the extra wire? I did. The section was worse than Birch had said. He looked at the entry. You estimated right. I estimated with Ernesto's help. You estimated right, he said again, as though the second saying made it more official. He closed the ledger and looked at her. He looked like someone who had been through something and was in the early stages of coming out the other side, thin around the face, with the quality of having been stripped down to something essential. I want you to tell me everything you made a decision about while I was down. So she did. She sat at the small table in the storage room turned sick room and told him all of it. The hay bill, the fence, the cattle rotations, the water trough, the conversations with Ernesto, the supplier's man from Dodge City. She told him about the decision she was uncertain about and the one she'd gotten wrong and the reasoning behind each one. She laid it out the way she'd come to lay everything out with him, plainly, without managing how it sounded. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, The east fence, that wasn't wrong. It was conservative, but the reasoning was right. Birch disagreed. Birch is good at fence work. He's less good at thinking about what happens if he's wrong. He paused. The supplier situation, did you get his name? Marsh, Edgar Marsh. That's not our regular man. She looked at him. He had the invoice. I know. Marsh has been known to show up at ranches when the owner's not available and collect for invoices that are 3 months premature. He paused. How much did he say we owed? When she told him, he said a word she hadn't heard him use before and then said, Did you pay it? No, I told him I didn't authorize payments for the owner and he'd need to come back. She paused. He was not pleased about that. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Good, he said. You would have caught it. You caught it, he said. That's the point. She stood up to take the ledger back to his office, and he said, Clara. She stopped. I need to say something. His voice had the quality it got when he was going to be direct about something he hadn't entirely worked out yet. While I was sick, what you did, the ranch, the boys, sitting up at night, that's... He paused, and she could see him being honest with himself about something. That's not nothing. It's not something I can pay you a wage for. She looked at him. He was sitting on the edge of the cot in the lamplight, the ledger on his knee, looking like a man who has said most of what he needed to say and is waiting to see how it lands. I know, she said. She kept her voice even. Neither is carrying Samuel across the yard every time he falls asleep near the barn, or finding that grammar book for Daniel, which I know you did because I found the receipt in the kitchen. She paused. We've been doing a lot of things for each other that don't fit a wage structure. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. We have. She took the ledger to his office and stood there for a moment in the cold of the unheated room, looking at the shelf where he kept his books and the framed survey map of the ranch property pinned to the wall, and she let herself think clearly about what had just happened, what had been happening for months, and what she was going to do about it. She didn't have a clean answer. She was not a woman who was afraid of uncertain things, but she was a woman who had made decisions from desperation before and felt the cost of it afterward, and she was trying very deliberately, to make decisions differently this time. She went back to the kitchen and started the midday meal. Wyatt was on his feet by the end of the week, moving carefully at first, and then with increasing purpose, until by the following Monday he was almost back to full operation and Clara was back to her own work in something like the old rhythm. But it wasn't quite the old rhythm. Things had been said in the small hours of the fourth night that couldn't be unsaid. Not dramatic things, not declarations. Just truths, said quietly, in a room where there wasn't enough energy for anything but honesty. And truths, once spoken, had a way of changing the shape of the space between people. She noticed it in small ways. He started including her in conversations with Ernesto about the ranch operations as a matter of course, not as a courtesy. When the supplier issue with Edgar Marsh turned into a more complicated situation, it turned out Marsh had pulled the same approach on 3 other ranches in the county. Wyatt mentioned it to her first before Pete and talked through how to handle it with her as though her assessment was part of how he worked things out. She started leaving the ranch accounts review with her addition of the household costs included, which he started incorporating into the monthly total without comment. The Hollis brothers had both recovered and returned, and Denny Hollis was different than he'd been. Not friendlier exactly, but quieter about his opinions. She didn't know what had passed between him and Wyatt while she was managing the sick bunkhouse, and she didn't ask. Whatever it was had been private and Wyatt's to handle. February arrived brutal and honest, the way February in that territory did. The cold was a different animal from January, less dramatic but more relentless, the kind that got into the buildings and required the stoves to be maintained through the night. She and Wyatt had fallen into an unconscious pattern of shared mornings, both of them up before the hands, both in the kitchen in the early dark with coffee and the day's first accounting of what needed doing. It was not a romantic arrangement. It was not particularly comfortable either. It was 2 people who were both watching something develop between them and neither of them quite ready to address it directly. But they had the early mornings and the coffee and the habit of honesty they'd built across 5 months. And that was, she thought, not a small thing. The crisis that broke the remaining distance between them had nothing to do with the ranch. It came on a Tuesday night when Samuel woke up crying. Not the ordinary crying of a child having a bad dream, but the specific sound that any mother recognizes as something wrong. She was at his bunk in seconds. He was clutching his stomach, his face white, and when she felt his forehead, she thought, here we go, not influenza this time. Something worse in its way. The kind of stomach illness that comes fast and hits children especially hard, the kind that required constant management through the night. She had him settled in the bunkhouse with a bucket and a damp cloth, and she was doing the things you do, changing cloths, and talking him through it, and watching his color with the particular alert attention of a mother managing real fear. When she heard the bunkhouse door and turned to find Wyatt in the doorway. I heard him, he said. We're fine. He looked at Samuel, who was in the gray-faced misery of a sick child, and then at her, and he came inside without being invited. He pulled up the other stool and sat on the other side of Samuel's bunk without asking, and he talked to Samuelson quietly about the horses, about a story involving Ernesto and a particularly stubborn calf, in the low, even way that occupied a sick child's mind without requiring them to do anything. She watched it from across the bunk and felt something so complex and so quiet that she couldn't have named it if she'd tried. Around midnight, Samuel finally slept, genuinely, and she and Wyatt both sat back and breathed. He'll be all right, Wyatt said. I know. She did know. It was the kind of sick that was bad and then over. Thank you. You didn't need to. He's a kid, Wyatt said. He was sick. She looked at him across the small sleeping form of her youngest son. The lamp was turned low. He was looking at her with the direct, ungoverned attention of someone who has stopped managing what they show. Wyatt, she said. I know, he said. We haven't talked about it properly. No. I don't know how to do it wrong again, she said. She said it plainly, which was the only way she knew how to say true things. I've been careful every time there was a decision to make since January last year, and I've made some right ones and some wrong ones. I don't know where this... She gestured inadequately at the space between them. Where this falls in that. He looked at her steadily. I'm not a simple thing to take on, he said. I know that about myself. I'm set in how I work. I don't change direction fast. I've got my way of running this ranch, and most of the time, I'm not interested in amending it. I know that. And you've got 3 boys, and you've got your own way of thinking about everything, and you're not interested in changing that either. No, she agreed. I'm not. So we'd be 2 people with too many opinions between them, he said, trying to run a household and a ranch and a set of children and probably arguing regularly. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That sounds accurate." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. More like a man arriving at a conclusion after long deliberation. "I'm not going to do anything about it tonight," he said. "You've got a sick kid and I've been awake since 2 this morning, but I want you to know I'm aware of it." "I'm aware of it too," she said. "Good." Samuel made a small sound in his sleep, and they both looked at him and then back at each other and then away. She sat with her son until morning, and Wyatt sat on his side of the bunk until past 3, when she told him to go back to the house. And he did, reluctantly, and she was left with the lamp and the sound of the wind and a 6-year-old sleeping soundly, and a feeling in her chest like a door that was being carefully, slowly opened after a very long time of being shut. She hadn't decided yet whether she was going to walk through it, but she was standing at it, and she thought for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember that might be enough for tonight. Samuel recovered in 2 days, as she'd known he would, and came out of it with the resilience that small children have, eating twice his normal breakfast on the 3rd morning, demanding to see the barn cats, acting as though the whole incident had been an inconvenience rather than a night that had aged his mother somewhat. Clara watched him run across the yard toward the barn and felt the particular exhausted relief of a mother who has been frightened and is now pretending she wasn't. She and Wyatt did not speak about the conversation in the bunkhouse. Not the next day, not the day after. They moved through the work of the ranch in their usual way, the coffee in the early morning, the daily accounting of what needed doing, the occasional decision she was consulted on, and the occasional one she brought to him. The difference was a thing she could feel but not point to, something that had shifted in the quality of the space between them, a kind of awareness that hadn't been there before in quite the same form, or had been there but unacknowledged, which amounted to the same practical effect. She was not going to push it. She was also not going to pretend it wasn't happening, because pretending things weren't happening had never been her particular weakness. She was more inclined to look at a problem directly and then decide what to do with it. And what she had decided to do with this one was wait and see whether Wyatt was a man who said things and then let them sit permanently, or whether he was a man who said things and then, in his own time, followed them. She thought she knew which one he was. She was fairly certain. She waited. February moved through the territory like something with a grudge. 2 more weeks of hard cold, then a brief thaw that turned everything to mud and made the cattle work twice as difficult. Then another freeze that came overnight and caught 2 of the water troughs unprepared. Clara was helping Ernesto break ice at the East Trough on a Monday morning when she heard the wagon coming up the ranch road and turned to see a man she didn't recognize driving it. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the weather, with the kind of face that had learned to present pleasantness as a professional tool. He stopped the wagon in the yard and looked around with the assessing gaze of someone taking inventory. "Looking for Mercer," he said. "He's out on the South Range," Clara said. "He'll be back around midday." The man looked at her with the slight recalibration people did when they had assumed she was domestic help and were updating their estimate. "And you are?" "Clara Whitmore. I manage the household." "Nathaniel Cray." He said it like it should mean something. "I have business with Mercer. I'll wait." He waited in the yard, which was slightly odd. She offered the kitchen, which he declined with a smile that didn't reach far enough. She went back to helping with the trough and kept him at the edge of her awareness. When Wyatt came back, she watched the greeting from the kitchen window. She couldn't hear what was said, but she could read the body language well enough. Wyatt's posture had changed, not to hostility, but to that particular stillness he got when he was paying close attention to something he didn't fully trust. They talked for perhaps 10 minutes in the yard, and then Wyatt brought Cray into the main house and through to his office. And Clara put coffee on and took it in because there are things you do in a ranch kitchen that give you a reason to be somewhere. Cray was explaining something about land. She caught it in pieces: grazing rights, a boundary survey, a question about the eastern edge of the Rocking M's territory near the creek that ran through both properties. She set the coffee down and withdrew, without appearing to, and stood in the kitchen and thought. Wyatt came out 40 minutes later. He poured himself coffee he didn't drink and stood at the window looking at the yard. "What is he?" she said. He glanced at her. He'd stopped being surprised by her directness some time back. "Land agent. Works for a land holding company out of Wichita. They've been buying up spread boundaries all winter. They acquire the grazing rights on the edge parcels, and then they've got effective control of the water access for anyone whose property runs against theirs. He wants your creek boundary. He wants to discuss it. He said it in a way that conveyed that discussion was not what was actually on offer. What happens if you don't sell? Then they buy from my neighbor on the other side, and whoever ends up between them eventually has a practical problem. He set the coffee down. It's a long play. These companies are patient. She thought about it. What's the survey situation? Is your eastern boundary clearly recorded? He looked at her. The original survey was done in 1871. There may be ambiguities. Maybe, or are. Cray seems to think there are. Whether he's right or whether he's planning to create them is the question. She sat down at the kitchen table. You need to see the original survey documents. I know that. And you need someone who understands land law to look at them before you talk to Cray again. She paused. Margaret Alderton mentioned once that her late husband was a surveyor. She might know who to consult. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. That's a good thought. Also, don't let him come back without someone else present. If there's a dispute later about what was said or offered, you want a witness. He looked at her across the kitchen with the expression she'd come to recognize as him deciding something. How do you know about land law? James dealt with a boundary dispute in '74. I sat through 3 months of conversations about it. She paused. He lost, eventually, because he talked to the wrong people in the wrong order and assumed his position was stronger than the paperwork supported. Wyatt nodded slowly. I'll write to Margaret today. Nathaniel Cray came back the following Thursday. He found Wyatt in the kitchen with Clara and Ernesto, which was not the private meeting he had apparently expected. The pleasantness on his face worked harder than it had on Monday. I was hoping we might speak privately, he said. Anything you've got to say to me can be said here, Wyatt told him. Mrs. Whitmore manages the ranch accounts. Ernesto manages field operations. They're part of any land discussion. Cray looked at Clara with a reassessment that was almost visible. She met it without expression. The meeting was shorter than the first one. Cray laid out his company's interest in the creek boundary parcel, which was 300 acres at the eastern edge of the Rocky Nemm. He named a price that was not unreasonable, which was its own warning sign. He spoke about the ambiguities in the 1871 survey with the careful specificity of a man who has done his research. The survey question is interesting, Clara said when he paused. Have you filed any formal challenge to the recorded boundary? Cray looked at her. Not as yet. Then the recorded boundary stands, she said. And any offer you're making is for land that is legally and clearly Rocky Nemm property, which Mr. Mercer is, of course, free to sell or not sell as he chooses. She paused. Have you had your company's survey done, or are you working from the 1871 document? A brief silence. We have our own review underway. When it's complete, we'd be interested to see it, she said. Compared against ours, of course. After he left, Ernesto looked at Clara with something between admiration and caution. You told him we had our own survey, he said. We will have one, she said. Margaret Alderton gave us a name this morning. He can be here by the end of the month. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. You've been working on this since Tuesday. Someone had to, she said. You were busy with the freeze. He turned toward the window, and she could see the side of his face, the particular quality of a man who is feeling something he hasn't fully authorized yet. He stayed like that for a moment. Thank you, he said. It came out differently than the practical thank yous they'd exchanged over 5 months. It had weight in it. You're welcome, she said, and went back to the bread she'd been making before Cray arrived. The surveyor came out on the last day of February, a careful, methodical man named Aldous Price, who spent 3 days walking the eastern boundary with Wyatt and produced a document that confirmed the 1871 survey's boundary line with one small correction that actually extended the Rocky Nemm's claim by 40 yards. Clara read the document twice when Wyatt brought it in. Then she read the relevant section of the 1871 survey, which Wyatt had written away for and received by post. Then she sat at the kitchen table and said, He was bluffing about the ambiguity. Oh? Bar sorts. Yeah, Wyatt said. Or his company told him there was an ambiguity and he believed them without checking. Same result either way. He sat down across from her. Cray's going to come back. Let him. You have 2 surveys now. She looked up. You should also write to the county recorder's office in Dodge and register Price's survey officially. The sooner it's on record, the less room there is for a later dispute. Already drafted the letter, he said. She looked at him. He was almost smiling. You drafted it yourself. This morning, before you'd finished reading Price's document. He paused. You're not the only one who thinks ahead. She felt herself smile back, which was not something she'd been doing a lot of in the past several months and was, she noticed, increasingly easy to do in his specific company. No, she said. You're right. I keep forgetting that. You don't forget it, he said. You just like being thorough. She went back to the document, but she was aware of him sitting across the table and aware that he hadn't moved to get up, and aware that the kitchen was quiet in the particular way of 2 people who have stopped pretending there isn't something else they could be talking about. Wyatt, she said without looking up. Yeah. Are you going to say something? A pause. I'm working up to it. She put the document down. She looked at him directly, which was something she'd always done and something he'd always done back, and that habit of looking at each other without the usual social flinching had been one of the things, she could see this clearly now, that had built whatever this was between them, piece by piece, over 5 months. Take your time, she said, but not too much of it. He looked at her for a long moment with his hands flat on the table. I want you to stay, he said. Not as the cook, not as the household manager. I want... He paused, and she could see him being honest with himself in real time, which was not an easy thing to watch because it was clearly not an easy thing to do. I want you to stay because you belong here. Because this... He stopped again. Because what we've built here in 5 months is more real to me than most things I can say that about. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm aware, she said carefully, that I came here with almost nothing, and that there are people in this town who have a story about that, and about what I want from you. I know what you want, he said. I've been watching you for 5 months. You want your sons to be all right. You want to do work that matters. You want to not be at the mercy of other people's decisions about your life. He looked at her steadily. None of that involves using me. That's not who you are. She pressed her hands together on the table. I loved my husband, she said. I've been honest about that. He was difficult and sometimes infuriating, and he made decisions without me, and he also read to my children every night and could make me laugh even when I was furious with him. That was real. I know it was. I'm not looking to replace that. I'm not asking you to. He said it simply. I'm asking you to build something different, not better or worse. Different. She looked at him. She thought about standing in the cold south pasture in October, just standing there with him, aware of being somewhere specific instead of passing through. She thought about the 4th night of his fever and what had been said in the small hours without anyone planning to say it. She thought about the work gloves on the table, sized to fit her hands. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I have opinions about everything, and I express them. I know. I'll interfere in ranch decisions. You already do. And I'll be right about some of them, and wrong about some of them, and I won't always know the difference in the moment. Neither will I. He paused. We'll argue about it. Yes, she said. We will. He looked at her steadily. Is that a yes? She thought about James, and about the life she'd had, and about how grief had changed shape over time from something that swallowed her to something she carried. She thought about Pittsburgh and the closed door at the Whitmore house, and $2.31, and a storm coming in from the west. She thought about how far she was from that woman, and also how completely she was still that woman, and how that was not a contradiction she needed to resolve. Yes, she said. It's a yes. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and they sat like that in the kitchen for a moment in the way of 2 people who have arrived somewhere they both intended but are still slightly surprised to actually be there. And then he cleared his throat and said, I should probably speak to Thomas. She had not thought about that, and it startled her into a laugh, which was unusual enough that he looked at her with something that was unmistakably warmth. Thomas is 11, she said. Thomas has been running an informal assessment of me since October, Wyatt said. I'd rather ask than not. He was right. She knew he was right. Yes, she said. You should probably speak to Thomas, Seb. The conversation with Thomas happened that evening on the corral fence, which was apparently the location Thomas had adopted for serious discussions, perhaps because it gave him something to do with his hands. Clara watched from the kitchen window and made herself look away after a few minutes because whatever was being said was theirs. Thomas came in for dinner with the face of someone who has received a lot of information and is processing it. He sat through most of the meal in unusual quiet, and then he looked at Wyatt and said, "You said you'd look after her." "I said I'd try," Wyatt corrected, which was apparently the right answer because Thomas nodded. "And us," Thomas said. "All of us." "All of you," Wyatt said. Daniel had been following this exchange with the intensity of a child who understands more than adults credit. "Does that mean we're staying?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. "Good," Daniel said. "I've already named all the cats. It would be complicated to leave them." Samuel, who had been eating with the focused dedication of a child who had recently been sick and was making up for lost time, looked up and said to Wyatt, "Are you going to be our father now?" The kitchen went very quiet. Wyatt looked at Samuel with the expression she'd caught once before, the unguarded one, the one she wasn't supposed to see. He was quiet for a moment. "If you'll have me," he said. Samuel appeared to consider this with the grave seriousness he brought to important matters. "Yes," he said. Then he went back to his food, which settled the matter as far as he was concerned. Clara looked at her plate and did not let herself cry, which required some effort. What she hadn't fully calculated, what she understood was naive of her, given everything she'd already experienced in Red Hollow, was the community's response. Not to the marriage itself, which Wyatt had told her he intended to make formal and public and proper in every way that the territory recognized. That part she'd expected to generate reaction. What she hadn't expected was the particular form it took, or the direction it came from. Mabel Forsyth came to the church hall on a Thursday morning session with two other women, Mary Aldrich and a woman Clara knew only slightly, a Mrs. Crane, and waited until the children had gone at midday. Clara was cleaning the board when she turned and found them arranged in the room with the particular formation of people who have organized themselves to deliver something. "We've heard," Mabel said. There was no preamble. Mabel was not a preamble kind of woman. "About you and Wyatt Mercer." "I imagine you have," Clara said. She set down the cleaning cloth and faced them directly. "Some of us feel—" Mabel paused, and her eyes moved to the other two women and back, as though checking she still had her group, "that this has happened very quickly, and under circumstances that are convenient," Clara offered. Mabel's jaw tightened. "I was going to say irregular." "Irregular," Clara repeated. She looked at the three women and thought about what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it, and decided to be very precise. "I came to Red Hollow in August with nothing. I found work, I did it well, I contributed to this community by teaching your children for 4 months without complaint, and with materials, I arranged myself. I kept a ranch running through an influenza outbreak that could have bankrupted it. And at the end of all of that, Wyatt Mercer and I arrived at an honest decision about a future together." She paused. "I'm curious specifically which part is irregular." Mary Aldrich had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mrs. Crane was looking at the wall. Mabel Forsyth did not look uncomfortable. "You came here with nothing," she said, "and now you stand to inherit a significant property." "I stand to marry a man," Clara said. "The property is his and will remain his. I haven't asked for anything regarding property, and I won't." "That's what you say now." "Mabel." That was Mary Aldrich, quietly. "Perhaps—" "It's what I said and what I mean," Clara continued, over Mary's intervention. "But I understand that my word isn't sufficient for some people, and I understand that won't change regardless of what I do or don't do. That's a thing I've accepted." She looked at Mabel Forsyth directly. "What I won't accept is the implication that Wyatt Mercer is a man who can be managed or deceived by a woman with 3 children and $11 in her pocket. He's considerably smarter than that, and suggesting otherwise is more insulting to him than anything you've said about me." A silence. Mrs. Crane made a small noise that might have been a suppressed laugh. "I'd like to get back to preparing for tomorrow's session," Claire said. "If there's something specific about my teaching you'd like to raise, I'm happy to hear it." They left. Mabel Forsythe left without a word, which Clara thought was probably the best outcome available. Mary Aldrich paused at the door and said quietly, "For what it's worth, the Abernethy children have come on tremendously." She left before Clara could respond. She told Wyatt about it that evening. She told it straight, as she always did with him, and he listened with his particular quality of attention, and when she finished, he said, "I should go speak to Gerald Forsythe." "You don't—" "I want to." He paused. "Not to argue. To make clear where things stand. He needs to hear it from me directly, not from Mabel's version of what you said." "It won't change her mind." "No," he agreed, "but it might change whose side Gerald is on when she's talking, which changes how far the talk goes." This was, she thought, a better understanding of small-town dynamics than she'd given him credit for, and she said so. "I've lived here 8 years, he said, with the faint dryness he used when he thought she was underestimating him. "I know how it works." He went the following Saturday. He was gone for 3 hours, which was longer than she'd expected. When he came back, he said Forsythe had been more reasonable than anticipated, and that he'd also stopped at the Aldrich house and the Crane house, and that Margaret Alderton had ridden into town for her own purposes and had apparently had several conversations that Wyatt had not requested, but that had, by his account, been effective. "Margaret," Clara said. "She has opinions about Mabel Forsythe," Wyatt said, with the understatement of a man who has just witnessed something significant and is choosing brevity. Clara made a note to thank Margaret Alderton with something more substantial than words. What she had not let herself think about clearly, until it forced itself into her attention, was the grief. Not for James. She had been living with that grief in its various forms for over a year, and she knew its shape. But a different grief, or a complication of the existing one, that surfaced in the 3rd week of March on a night when she couldn't sleep and found herself sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with James's watch. The one thing she'd kept from his personal effects, a silver watch with a small dent on the back from the time he'd dropped it in the street in 1872. She sat there with it in her palm and she thought, "I'm going to marry someone else." The thought was obvious. She'd said yes. She'd meant it. But there is a difference between a decision made in the clear-eyed practicality of a winter afternoon and the same decision confronted at 3 a.m. with her dead husband's watch in her hand, and she sat with both of them for a while. She had not stopped loving James. She was not sure she ever would, entirely, and she thought that was probably all right. People were not simple enough for their love to simply transfer from one place to another. What she felt for Wyatt Mercer was real, but it was different. It had been built differently, out of different materials, and it would be a different life. Acknowledging that didn't diminish either thing. It just made them both true at once, which was harder to hold but more honest. She put the watch in her pocket. She kept it there, not as a hidden thing, but as a carried one. And she thought James would have understood the distinction. He had not been, in the end, a man who required the world to be simple. She got up and made coffee and sat in the kitchen until the sky outside the window started to go from black to deep blue to gray. And then she heard boots on the porch, and Wyatt came through the door and stopped when he saw her. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." She stood and took his coat from him and hung it. "I was thinking about James." He looked at her without any visible alarm, which was one of the things about him. He didn't need her to manage what she felt for his comfort. "All right," he said. "I just wanted you to know that," she said, "that it happens. That it's going to keep happening sometimes, and it's not." She looked for the right word. "It's not a problem. It's just a fact." He was quiet for a moment. "Ellen," he said. "Probably the same." "Yes." "I still hear her sometimes," he said, "when I'm out on the ranch alone, in the way the light goes on a particular kind of morning." He paused. "I've decided that's all right." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." She poured him coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the early gray light, and neither of them said anything else, which was enough. March moved toward April. The ground thawed, and the ranch came into the busy season, and Clara was in the middle of all of it. The teaching, the household, the account reviews, the conversations with Wyatt about the land situation with Cray's company, which had gone quiet but not away. She had written twice to the county recorder's office and received confirmation that Price's survey was on official record, which she filed alongside the original 1871 document in Wyatt's office, in a folder she'd labeled with the kind of specificity that she knew would annoy someone trying to claim ambiguity later. She told Harriet Oakes in April that the community would need to find a permanent teacher by fall. She said it plainly. She would be taking on different responsibilities. The position needed someone dedicated to it, and she knew a woman in St. Louis who had been looking for a frontier placement and who was well qualified. Harriet looked at her with the expression she'd had the first time they'd spoken, sharp, recalibrating. "You've already found her," Harriet said. "Her name is Ruth Combs. She'll come in September if the community can commit to proper compensation." She slid a piece of paper across to Harriet. "I wrote down what proper compensation looks like." Harriet looked at the paper. "This is more than we've paid before." "I know," Clara said. "The previous arrangement wasn't sustainable. That's why you lost your last teacher." Harriet looked at her for a long moment and then folded the paper. "I'll bring it to the council." The council approved it the following week. Clara wrote to Ruth Combs the same day. On the 15th of April, on a morning that was cold enough for coats but had the particular quality of a day that intends to warm up, Wyatt came into the kitchen and stood at the table in the way she'd learned meant he'd decided something. "I want to do this properly," he said, "before the community, not because of what people will say, because it should be witnessed." "I know," she said. "I want that too." "May," he said, "if that's enough time." She thought about what May meant. 6 months since she'd arrived in Red Hollow with 3 boys and $2 and a broken wagon axle 3 miles from town. 6 months since a man had crossed a rainy street without being asked and offered a dry place to land. "May is enough time," she said. He nodded with the finality of a man who has made a decision and filed it. He moved toward the door and then stopped. "Your boys," he said. "I want to do right by them." "I know you do." I know I'm not their father." He paused, and she could hear the careful weight of a man trying to say something precisely. "But I'd like to be someone they can rely on, in a real way, not just shelter." She looked at him. "Thomas already does," she said, "and Samuel committed weeks ago. Daniel will take slightly longer because he needs to decide for himself, but he'll get there." Something crossed his face that she thought was relief, and she was glad because she knew he hadn't been certain of that. The certainty was hers to give, and she gave it without reservation. "May," he said. "May," she confirmed. He went out to start the morning work, and Clara turned back to the bread she'd been making, and the kitchen filled with the smell of it, and the ranch outside was beginning its spring noise, the cattle, the horses, the sound of Ernesto's voice somewhere near the barn, and Thomas, who she could hear telling Samuel something about the correct way to approach a horse from the side. She stood at the counter and pressed her palms into the dough and looked out the window at the ordinary, extraordinary fact of a morning that was hers, that she had built from almost nothing, that no one had handed to her. She thought, "I did this." And then she went back to work. The wedding was on a Saturday in the second week of May, and it almost didn't happen on time because Thomas lost one of his good boots the morning of and spent 40 minutes looking for it while Clara stood in the bunkhouse in her best dress, dark blue wool, let out at the seams because she'd had it since Pittsburgh, and her shoulders had broadened from 8 months of actual physical work, and practiced not raising her voice. The boot was eventually found under Daniel's bunk, where it had apparently migrated through means that Daniel claimed were mysterious and unexplained. Clara looked at her middle son, and he looked back at her with the expression of someone who is technically telling the truth about his ignorance of events. She put the boot on Thomas's foot herself and said, "Not one more thing," to the room in general, and the room understood her. They drove into Red Hollow on the ranch wagon, all 5 of them plus Ernesto, who had put on a clean shirt and whose hair was pressed flat with extraordinary neatness, and who had the look of a young man who takes celebrations seriously. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of May morning that the territory produced when it was in a good mood, and the cottonwoods along the road had their new leaves, pale green and restless in the light wind. Wyatt was waiting outside the building where the community held its civil proceedings, the same building where Clara had been teaching for 8 months. which felt appropriate in a way she didn't examine too closely. He was wearing a dark coat she hadn't seen before, and he'd done something with his hair that suggested the involvement of water and effort. He looked, she thought, exactly like himself, which was the only thing she'd ever wanted from him. He looked at her when the wagon stopped, and he said nothing, which was also exactly like him. "You look fine," she said, which was not what she meant, but was what came out. "So do you," he said, in the same register. They went inside. The community had come. That was the first thing she registered when she walked in. The room was full, not with the thin attendance of obligation, but with actual people, crowded onto the benches, standing along the wall. She saw Harriet Oakes and her husband in the third row. She saw Birch Hollis, without his brother, who had left the ranch in March and gone south. But Birch was there, hat in hand, with the look of a man who had made some private accounting of himself and arrived at a decent number. She saw the Abernethy family, all 7 of them, with the children she'd been teaching for most of a year. She saw Margaret Alderton near the front, wearing a hat that suggested she'd made an effort, and who caught Clara's eye and gave her a look that communicated several things without words, most of them warm. Mabel Forsythe was there too, in the 5th row with her husband. Clara saw her, and Mabel saw her seeing her, and neither of them looked away immediately. Mabel's expression was not friendly, exactly, but it was present, and presence, Clara had learned, was its own kind of statement in a small community. You came, or you didn't, and Mabel Forsythe had come. She filed that away under sufficient. Gerald Forsythe performed the ceremony, which was brief and civil, because that was what both she and Wyatt had wanted. No performance, no theater, just the legal fact of it, witnessed and recorded in a room full of people who had watched them earn this over 8 months of difficult, ordinary, real days. Wyatt held her hand through the whole thing with a grip that was firmer than strictly necessary, which she thought was probably as close as he would get to showing nerves in public. And she held his right back in the same way, because she was not as far from nerves as she appeared. When it was done, Samuel said, "Finally," with great feeling, which broke the solemnity of the room entirely and produced a laugh that Clara thought would have lasted longer, except that Samuel looked confused by the response, and that made it funnier. Thomas shook Wyatt's hand. He shook it like a man, or like an 11-year-old practicing to be one, and Wyatt shook it back with the seriousness the gesture deserved. Daniel presented Wyatt with a drawing he'd made of the ranch from memory, which was detailed and slightly anatomically incorrect regarding the barn's proportions, and which Wyatt accepted with the straight-faced gravity of someone receiving important documents. Clara saw his face for a half-second before he composed it. She turned away to give him the moment. The reception, such as it was, happened in the yard outside. The community had organized something, which meant Harriet Oakes had organized something and told people what to bring, and there was food on tables and the kind of informal gathering that frontier communities do well when they decide to do it. Clara moved through it in a slight daze, shaking hands and accepting words and trying to track where all 3 of her sons were at any given moment, which was her permanent background occupation. Margaret Alderton got to her near the end of the afternoon and took both her hands and said, without preamble, "You did it right." "I didn't have a plan," Clara said. "Yes, you did. You had the only plan that works. You showed up and you stayed, and you did the work in front of everyone until there was nothing left to argue about." Margaret's hands tightened briefly. "That's all it ever is. People just don't tell you that." Clara thought about August, the broken axle, the rain, the closed door, the $2.31. She thought about standing in the road with 3 children and making herself keep walking because standing still wasn't an option. She thought about how many times in the past 8 months she'd done something, not because she was certain it was right, but because she was certain she had to try. "How's the land situation?" Margaret asked in the same breath, because Margaret Alderton was a woman who didn't separate the personal from the practical, and Clara liked her enormously for it. "Quiet," Clara said. Cray's company made one more approach in March, and Wyatt declined formally in writing, with Price's survey referenced. "We haven't heard from them since." "They'll try again in a few years," Margaret said, "with someone new who doesn't know the history." "We'll have the history filed in 3 different places by then," Clara said. Margaret laughed. "Good woman," she said, and moved on. Bam! Nathaniel Cray had, in fact, made his final approach in March, and it had not gone the way he'd intended. He'd come on a weekday afternoon when he'd apparently expected Wyatt to be out on the range. Instead, he'd found Clara in the main house, reviewing the accounts as she did every Wednesday, and she'd listened to his revised offer. Higher this time, which told her the company had recalculated the parcel's value, with the patience of someone who already knows how the conversation ends. I appreciate the revised figure, she said, but the answer is the same. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. It was the last time he'd used that name. In 2 weeks, it would be Mrs. Mercer. I want to be direct with you. My company has significant resources and considerable experience in these boundary situations. It would be in everyone's interest to resolve this amicably. She looked at him. Is that a threat? He smiled the professional smile. It's a practical observation. Here's my practical observation, she said. She opened the folder on the desk, the one she'd labeled with careful specificity, and laid out Price's survey, the 1871 document, and the confirmation from the county recorder's office. She laid them in a row, neatly, where he could see them. We have 2 concurrent surveys confirming the same boundary line, both on official record in Dodge City. We have the original grant documentation. We have records of every conversation your company has had with this ranch, including dates and what was said, witnessed by at least 2 people each time. She paused. If your company proceeds with any formal challenge to our boundary, we will meet it in court with everything in this folder, and we will win. Not because we're lucky, but because we're correct, and we can prove it. She looked at him. Now, is there anything else I can help you with today? He left. He did not come back. She told Wyatt about it that evening, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, You had all of that ready. I've had it ready since February, she said. I was waiting for him to come back. He looked at her across the kitchen table. You let me do the letter to the county recorder. It was your land, she said. The strategy was mine. That's not the same thing. He thought about that. No, he said. It's not. And then, with the particular quality of a man who is capable of learning things about himself, we need to talk about how we're going to make decisions, going forward. Yes, she said. We do. They had that conversation over 2 evenings, and it was not comfortable, and they disagreed on several specific points and arrived at something that wasn't a perfect system, but was an honest one. Her domain, his domain, and a category of things they decided together that was larger than either of them had initially proposed. She suspected the category would expand over time. She thought he probably knew that too. June arrived and brought the work of early summer, the cattle operations accelerating, the hayfields showing green, the constant maintenance that a working ranch required in the long days when there was light enough to work until 8 in the evening. Clara was in the middle of all of it, not as an observer or a helper, but as someone with actual authority over a portion of the operation, which was a thing she and Wyatt had formalized quietly and without ceremony. She managed the household finances, the supplier relationships, the community teaching coordination until Ruth Combs arrived in September, and any land or legal documentation that arose. He managed the cattle operations, the hands, the field decisions. Ernesto, who had been doing the work of 3 men for years, and who deserved considerably better recognition than he'd been getting, got a wage increase in the title of head foreman, which Wyatt announced at dinner one evening and which Ernesto received with the dignity of a man who had been waiting for the acknowledgement without holding his breath about it. Overdue, Clara said. By about 2 years, Ernesto said. Wyatt looked between them. I said it, he said. Can we move on? They moved on. Thomas turned 12 in June and Wyatt gave him a horse. Not one of the working ranch horses, a young quarter-horse mare that had been foaled on the ranch in March and that Thomas had been paying particular attention to since she was 2 weeks old. Wyatt brought her out of the barn on Thomas's birthday with a lead rope and handed it to the boy and said, She needs work. She'll be a good horse when she's had it. Thomas looked at the horse. He looked at Wyatt. He was 12, and he was trying very hard not to show what he was feeling, which was exactly what his father had done and exactly what he would do for the rest of his life. And Clara stood on the porch and watched it and held herself very still. Thank you, Thomas said. It came out slightly rough. She's yours, Wyatt said. You're responsible for her. I know. I'll show you what she needs. I know that too, Thomas said, And then, more quietly, "I've been watching." Wyatt looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "I know you have." The mare was named Compass, which Thomas announced at dinner as a settled fact, and no one questioned it. Daniel took longer. Clara had told Wyatt this, and she'd been right, and Wyatt had the patience for it, which she'd also known. Daniel was the middle son in all the ways that mattered: watchful, private about what he actually felt, slower to commit than either of his brothers, and more likely to arrive at his own position independent of anyone else's opinion. He was also, Clara had always thought, the most perceptive of the three, and that perception made him slower to trust because he saw more of what there was to see. He came to it on his own schedule, as she'd known he would. It was a Thursday evening in July, one of those long summer evenings where the light held until nearly 9, and the ranch had the loose quality of a place that has worked hard and is briefly resting. Daniel had been in Wyatt's office. She'd found them there twice before, with the survey maps spread on the desk, Daniel asking questions about the land boundaries with the focused curiosity he brought to things that genuinely interested him. This time when she passed the door, she heard Wyatt explaining the water rights situation in the kind of detail that most adults wouldn't bother with for an 8-year-old, and Daniel asking follow-up questions that suggested he'd understood everything. She didn't stop. She went to the kitchen and started the evening meal. Daniel came in an hour later and set the table without being asked, which he did sometimes and sometimes didn't, and he was quiet through dinner in the thinking way, not the unhappy way. After, when Thomas had gone to check on Compass, and Samuel was already asleep, Samuel, who fell asleep earlier than anyone and woke earlier than anyone, and had the sleep schedule of someone twice his age, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the drawing materials Harriet Oakes had found for him through some connection in Wichita, and drew. Clara was washing dishes. Wyatt was at the table with the account ledger. "The water rights thing," Daniel said, without looking up from his drawing. "The company that wanted the creek boundary. They wanted it because whoever controls the water controls everything around it." "Yes," Wyatt said. "So the way you stopped them was making sure the boundary was so clearly on record that challenging it would cost more than it was worth." "That's right." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his pencil moving. "That was Mama's idea." "A lot of it," Wyatt said. "But you did the letter to the county recorder." "She told me to." Daniel looked up. He looked at Wyatt with the 8-year-old version of an assessing look that Clara recognized from her own mirror. "You listen to her," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "When she's right," Wyatt said, "which is often." "Papa didn't always," Daniel said. He said it simply, not as a criticism, just as a fact he'd been carrying. He didn't always listen. The kitchen was quiet. "No," Wyatt said. He didn't qualify it or defend it. He just acknowledged it. Daniel looked back at his drawing. "Okay," he said, which meant something more than it looked like. He showed Clara the drawing before bed. It was the ranch, from above, the way he imagined it would look from a high enough elevation. The buildings, the fields, the creek along the eastern boundary. He'd labeled everything in his careful 8-year-old printing. The main house, the barn, the bunkhouse. And in one corner, in smaller letters, us. She held the drawing and looked at that word for a moment. "It's good," she said. "I know," he said, without vanity, just accurately, and went to bed. She put the drawing on the kitchen shelf where she kept the things that mattered. Ruth Combs arrived in September, as arranged, on the afternoon stage from Wichita. She was younger than Clara had expected, 26, with a practical face and the slightly over-prepared energy of someone who has thought very hard about a new situation and is now confronting the reality of it. Clara met her in town and showed her the church hall classroom and the lending library, which had grown to 23 books through Clara's continued correspondence with the St. Louis publisher, and Ruth walked through it with the expression of someone finding a room better than they'd been told. "The lending chart," Ruth said, looking at the system Clara had set up. "This is... Who organized this?" "I did," Clara said. "But it's yours now. Change whatever doesn't work." Ruth looked at her. "Why are you handing this off? You built it." Clara thought about how to answer that. "Because I built it for the community," she said. "Not for me. It needs someone whose whole attention is here, not half their attention." She paused. "The children have been well served. I want to make sure they stay that way." Ruth Combs stayed. She was good at the work in a different way than Clara had been. less instinctive, more methodical, but with a patience that Clara privately acknowledged was better suited to a permanent teaching role than her own particular temperament. By November, the session had grown to 22 children, and Ruth had started a correspondence with the Territorial Education Office about formal recognition. Clara had written this first letter to that office herself months earlier and had not mentioned it to anyone. She didn't mention it now either. The work was the point. The credit was not. The Cray situation resolved itself in October in the way that determined, documented patience usually resolves things, quietly, without drama, in the form of a letter from the Wichita Landholding Company informing them that the company had reviewed its portfolio and would not be pursuing further interest in the Rockingham's eastern boundary parcels. Clara read the letter twice, filed it in the folder with everything else, and told Wyatt over breakfast. He said, "Good," and went back to his coffee. She thought this was probably the most satisfying victory she'd experienced in her adult life, partly because of the outcome, and partly because of how it had been achieved, not through luck or charm or anyone's goodwill, but through preparation and patience, and the simple determination to be right on paper in ways that couldn't be argued with. She thought about Nathaniel Cray's company, with its significant resources and considerable experience in these boundary situations. She thought about herself in August of the previous year with $2.31 and 3 children and a broken axle. She thought, "You came to the wrong ranch, Ma." October brought a letter from Harold Whitmore. It arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Clara Mercer, which meant he'd heard about the marriage, and had gone to the trouble of using her current name, which she noted, and it was 2 pages in a hand she didn't recognize, which meant it was Harold himself writing, rather than Dora. He was sorry, the letter said. He'd been sorry since August of the previous year and hadn't known how to say it. And Dora had been, and here the letter got careful in a way that told its own story. Dora had been firm in her position at the time, and Harold had deferred when he shouldn't have. He had heard through various channels how things had gone. He was glad she and her sons were well. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't try to rebuild the connection he'd abdicated. He just said he was sorry, in the way that some people arrive at eventually, when the thing they didn't do has been sitting with them long enough. She read it twice. She thought about Dora Whitmore's closed door in the rain and what that night had cost her and what it had eventually led to. And she thought about how these things worked, how a door closing in one place sometimes opened something in another, not because the world was arranged for instruction, but because people are resourceful when they have to be, and she had always had to be. She wrote back. A short letter, honest and without warmth, she didn't feel, and without coldness, she didn't mean either. She told him her sons were well. She told him the ranch was doing well. She told him she bore no particular grievance, which was true. She had used her energy on things she could control, and Harold Whitmore's conscience was not one of them. She wished him well. She did not invite further correspondence. She mailed the letter and didn't think about it again, or tried not to. She told Wyatt about it that evening because she told him most things. "Good that he wrote," Wyatt said. "Yes," she said, "and good that I don't need anything from him." He looked at her. "You never did." "I know," she said, "but it's better to know it clearly than to know it as a theory." November. A year since the influenza, since the long nights in the storage room, since things that couldn't be said without the particular conditions of those particular days. The ranch had been running at full capacity since spring, the Hollis brothers replaced by 2 new hands who were younger and less complicated, the operation having absorbed the previous year's disruptions and adjusted. The account ledger, which Clara reviewed every Wednesday, showed a ranch that was not prospering exactly. The territory was not a prospering kind of place, which was part of what made it honest, but was stable, and stability was something she'd come to value with the specificity of a person who had lived without it. She was at the kitchen table doing the Wednesday review when she became aware of something she'd been half-tracking for 2 weeks and had not let herself address directly. She set down the pencil and sat with it for a moment. Then she went to find Wyatt. He was at the barn with Ernesto, reviewing something about one of the horses, and she waited until there was a natural pause and then said, "I need to talk to you." Ernesto found somewhere else to be with the efficiency of someone who has learned to read a room. Wyatt looked at her. He'd gotten good at reading her expressions, which she wasn't always certain she liked, but had come to accept as the natural consequence of living with someone who paid attention. "You're all right?" he said. "Yes." She looked at him. "I think I might be pregnant." The barn was very quiet. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Outside, Ernesto was conspicuously doing something at a significant distance. Wyatt stood completely still for a moment in the way he went still when he was taking in something large. Then something happened to his face, not the composed, measuring expression he wore most of the time, but something underneath it, something that she thought she was one of the very few people who had ever seen. "Are you sure?" he said. Not entirely, enough to say it out loud. He crossed the space between them and put his hands on either side of her face, which was not a thing he did, and looked at her for a moment. His hands were rough from the outdoor work and warm from it, and she looked back at him without managing her expression. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. He held her face in his hands for another moment, and then he put his arms around her in the plain, deliberate way he did most things, and she stood in the barn in November with her forehead against his shoulder and let herself be held, which was something she was still, even now, still learning how to do without reserving part of herself for the next problem. She was working on it. The baby arrived in July, which meant she was large through the hard part of winter and uncomfortable through the mud season of spring, and came to the end of it in the full heat of summer, which was not the timing she would have chosen, but was not something she'd been consulted on. She had a daughter, which she hadn't let herself anticipate because she'd only had sons and didn't want a thing she might not get. She got it. The baby was born on a Sunday morning with Wyatt present because she'd told him she wanted him there, and he'd stayed without flinching, which she had not been entirely certain about and had respected him enormously for. She weighed 7 pounds and had dark hair and the slightly furious expression of someone who has just been ejected from comfortable quarters without warning. They named her Ellen. She knew when she said it that it might be a complicated thing, naming a daughter after a woman who had been here first and loved here first, and she'd thought about it for months before she said it aloud to Wyatt. She'd thought about what it meant to be the second person to build a life in a space where someone else had already built one, and what you owed to that history and what you didn't, and what it meant to honor something without being consumed by it. She said the name and watched Wyatt's face, and what she saw there told her she'd been right. "Ellen," he said. "If you want something else, no," he said. He was looking at the baby in the way that people look at things they weren't prepared to feel this much about. "Ellen." Thomas, who was 13 by then, and had developed the reserve of early adolescence in some areas while remaining completely himself in others, held his sister with more care than Clara had expected and said, "She looks like you." "She doesn't look like anyone yet," Clara said. "She's 4 hours old." "She looks like you," Thomas repeated with the stubbornness of someone who has made an aesthetic assessment and stands by it. Samuel, who was 8 and who had been the baby of the family for his entire life, and who had taken the news of a coming sibling with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has already decided everything is going to be fine, looked at Ellen with bright interest and said, "She's small." "You were small," Clara said. "I was never that small," Samuel said with confidence. Daniel drew her. He sat across the room with his drawing materials and worked in silence for 20 minutes, while Clara held Ellen and Wyatt sat on the edge of the bed, and Thomas hovered in the doorway, and Samuel asked questions that no one fully answered, and when Daniel was done, he brought it over and showed it to them all. It was just a hand, Clara's hand, holding the baby. The detail in it was extraordinary for a 9-year-old. You could see the calluses on the knuckles, the worn look of a hand that had been used hard for years. And in the hand, small and complete, the baby. "Daniel," Wyatt said after a moment. "I know," Daniel said, which was what he always said about his drawings, and took it back to work on the shading. The winter that followed was harder than the previous two, which was the frontier's habit of reminding you that comfort was not a settled condition, but an ongoing negotiation. A section of the south barn roof came down in December under a heavy snow, which cost 3 weeks of cold repair work, and an amount of money that made Clara's account ledger look uncomfortable for a month. One of the new hands left in January for reasons that turned out to be personal and not their fault, but left them short-handed at the worst time. Ellen got a cold that lasted 6 weeks and required the kind of sustained attention that left everyone in the household slightly hollowed out. None of it broke anything. They bent and adjusted and kept going, which was, Clara had come to understand the actual texture of a life that was working, not the high points, not the moments of clear resolution, the ordinary hard days that you got through because you'd built something solid enough to get through them in, and because you weren't getting through them alone. She thought about this sometimes in the early mornings, which were still her most honest time, before the household woke, before the day announced its demands. She would sit with her coffee, and the ranch would be quiet except for its own sounds, and she would think about the woman who had walked 3 miles in a summer storm with a sick child on her hip and $2 in her pocket and nowhere to go. She didn't think of that woman as a different person. She was the same person. The same stubbornness, the same tendency to assess a problem from 4 angles before committing to a position, the same difficulty accepting help without immediately calculating how to return it. The same deep, persistent love for her sons that had been the only reliable constant through everything. The same grief for James, which had changed shape again. Softer now, more like a memory of weight than the weight itself. Something she carried with familiarity rather than effort. What had changed was the ground under her feet. She thought sometimes about the specific accident of Wyatt Mercer crossing a rain-soaked street toward a woman he didn't know. She thought about what would have made a man do that. Not charity, he'd been clear about that from the beginning, and she'd believed him. Something more like recognition. A man who had been lonely in the specific way of someone capable of more than they're currently being asked for. Seeing a woman in the particular kind of trouble that isn't weakness, but is circumstance. And making a decision that was practical on the surface and something else underneath. She'd never asked him directly what had made him cross the street. She thought she knew, and she also thought some things were better held as they were, not examined into transparency, but kept with a little of their original quality intact. She knew this. He had not rescued her. She had not rescued him either. What they had done was something more mutual and less clean than rescue. They had both been in positions where they needed something the world wasn't providing. And they had, through stubbornness and proximity and the slow work of honest days, built something that provided it. That was not a romantic story in the way people told romantic stories. There had been no sudden declaration, no dramatic moment of clarity, no point at which everything resolved into simplicity. There had been work gloves on a table, a drainage problem in the south pasture, coffee in the dark before sunup, a sick child, and 2 people sitting on either side of him in the small hours because neither of them could do otherwise. It was ordinary. It was also, she thought, exactly enough. On the last day of that second year, she stood at the kitchen window in the late afternoon light and watched what the ranch yard contained. Wyatt and Thomas coming in from the South Range on horseback, Thomas sitting the horse with the ease of someone who'd been riding for a year and had stopped thinking about it. Ernesto crossing toward the barn with the unhurried purpose he brought to everything. Daniel sitting on the fence with his sketchbook, drawing something she couldn't see from the window. Samuel running for no clear reason across the yard, the way 8-year-olds run, without destination, just running because the body demands it. And in the basket on the kitchen table behind her, Ellen sleeping with the complete confidence of a child who has never been required to be afraid. She looked at all of it. She looked at it carefully, the way you look at things you want to remember accurately. Not idealized, but actual. The mud on Thomas's boots, the way Wyatt was already talking to him about something, pointing at the south field, probably working through a problem. The uneven fence line that still needed that last section replaced. The barn where the roof had come down and been repaired, but not perfectly, because she and Wyatt had done part of it themselves, and she had been, she could admit, better at directing the work than doing it. She looked at all of it and she thought, I didn't deserve this. Not because she was unworthy of it, but because deserving had nothing to do with it. Life didn't distribute itself on merit. It moved in the directions people pushed it, and sometimes you pushed hard and got nothing, and sometimes you pushed in the right direction at the right moment, and the door opened, and the question was whether you walked through. She had walked through. That was all. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. She turned from the window and started dinner, and the ranch went on around her in its ordinary, specific, difficult, living way. The way things go on when someone has made them something worth continuing. And Clara Mercer, who had once been Clara Whitmore, who had once stood on a broken road 3 miles from nowhere with a sick child and a storm coming, put a pot on the stove and called out the window that dinner was in an hour and to wash their hands. Thomas called back that he knew. Samuel said something that wasn't quite a word. Daniel didn't answer, which meant he'd heard. Ellen slept. Wyatt came through the door 20 minutes later and stopped in the kitchen doorway the way he still sometimes did, not hesitating, more like taking in the room before he entered it. And Clara looked at him over her shoulder with the comfortable honesty of someone who has stopped managing what she shows. "Hard day?" she said. "Normal day," he said. "Good," she said, and turned back to the stove. He came in and hung his coat, and the door closed behind him against the evening, and the kitchen was warm with the smell of the meal she was making, and outside the territory was dark and vast and indifferent, and inside the lamp was lit. That was the whole of it. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.